when I think about people, the people involves the system of managing the people, which we kind of talked about at the end. Now, the second piece of systems, I think of that as these are the platforms, the SaaS applications that you're purchasing that help move all the information to create financial results.
From Numeric, this is Incoming Statements, the podcast built for forward-thinking accounting pros. Join Anthony Alvernaz, Numeric's co-founder and chief product officer, as he talks with accounting leaders about what practices and philosophies are defining modern financial operations. So grab your coffee, throw on some headphones, and let's dive in.
Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of Incoming Statements. I'm your host, Anthony Alvernaz, and this episode is brought to you by Numeric, AI-powered close and reporting automation for leading accounting teams. Today, our guest is Nate Carbrey, VP and Corporate Controller at Paddle. Nate, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
And we're happy you're here. To give the audience some background, would love if you could start pretty open-ended and tell us what's your story.
Yeah, so I started getting into accounting in high school and kind of fell in love with it. Followed a fairly traditional track, was at PwC for a handful of years in the audit practice, and then spent my last 3 companies serving different VC-backed startups in the high-growth scale-up phase.
Amazing. Tell us a little bit more about your global corporate controller role. What is the team like today? How is it composed? Any particular challenges that you're grappling with currently?
Yeah, so Paddle is a very international business. We process transactions in 40 plus currencies, but primarily operate in USD, Euro, and GB. We've got a team of about 15 folks on the accounting side that I manage, and an additional team of about 10 on the tax side, given we handle global tax compliance, sales tax, and VAT compliance for businesses. Some of the challenges is really just the inherent complexity of the business, given the volume of transactions that we do. We've got over $1 billion of funds flowing through our platform and navigating and managing all of that and supporting all of our customers. It's complex, but fun.
Absolutely. Amazing. Talk us through what does your close look like to that end? Obviously, highly complex, high volume, a lot of moving pieces. Where are you today in terms of close timeline?
Yeah, so let me just tell the brief story of how we got to where we are today. So I joined the business about 1.5 years ago. We did a handful of system implementations to optimize, but we started around 15 days. And then right now we're at about 9. We almost got to 8 as part of our year-end close, but I think I'd be cheating if I were to say we got there. So 9. We've implemented a new ERP system, moving from Xero to NetSuite, and we also put in Numeric as our close management tool to kind of organize everything that we do in order to figure out where can we optimize our close process to make it faster.
Amazing. So if we were to hone in on that sort of speed, obviously there's this sort of mythical concept of a 0-day close that some folks like to drive to in the sort of continuous context, believing that there is a continuous close that is possible. Others using that more as the sort of anchor to say, we're going to improve our processes and, ladder into as close as we can that goal of a 0-day close. When you think about this tactically, in terms of what you're seeing at Paddle, what you've seen in prior roles, how do you feel about that concept of a 0-day close? What are your sort of initial reactions?
Yeah, so I love the aspiration. I think the practicality isn't 100% there, depending on the business. So for a small business, and if you have a lot of automated processes, then I actually think it's kind of achievable. But I was talking to a company not too long ago, probably about 1.5 years ago, and they were talking about how they had a 1-day close. But in my mind, the more complex the business, the harder it is to get there. But to me, the golden mark is 5 to 7 business days.
Mm-hmm. And where do you see that complexity start to break down in terms of introducing more time, into the process? And asked differently, when you think about some of the foundational processes that you've built since joining Paddle in past roles, how do you think about scaling teams to just manage a certain volume of work versus trying to get in front of new challenges, insofar as that impacts your close timeline and that ability to get as close as you can to a 0-day close?
Yeah. So when I think about strategically how you approach, revamping or optimizing an accounting function, I really think of it as in three levels. The first is the foundational level, which is the people, the team. The second is the system layer. And the third, on top of the system layer, is your processes. And the reason I think about it that way is if you have an under-resourced accounting team and you have a, 20 plus day close, you're in like overlapping month-end closes, which means you're always in month-end close, which is a terrible place to be. One of the companies I was at was there when I joined, and it was challenging. But what you have to do is first make sure you've got the right resources and people that think the right way in order to actually optimize your close process. Then you need to make sure you've got the right systems to track and monitor, from a close management tool, from an ERP system. Is it sophisticated enough? And then it really reaches out to, okay, what are all the processes that exist around the company that are functionally feeding data into accounting as you produce the financial results?
I love it. So people, systems, and process all make sense as the sort of three components, one of which has to come before the other. There's the age-old question that I think applies to all of these. I'd love to get some of your thoughts on, starting with how do you find good people? With that being that primary foundation, what are you doing to attract the right talent? How are you assessing that and making sure that you're building the the elite team that makes it all happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if we're all honest, we've had successes and challenges in this space. Some people are really good at selling themselves, and you kind of get duped up front. But when I think about people, I say first there's really two types. First is, what is the team you're inheriting? So at the last three companies, like my current company and the last two, I inherited accounting teams, and then the second group of people is, okay, who are the people I'm going to bring in? So my personal philosophy is actually very simple. First, you need to really understand who is on the team and what are their strengths and weaknesses. What are the things they enjoy doing? What are the things they don't enjoy doing? Because when you have an understaffed team, oftentimes you have people just doing multiple roles, but they really only like one of them. And so for me, on the internal team perspective, you need a combination of people to have an effective accounting department. Some people are going to be processing transactions, doing AR and AP work, processing payments. There could be operational components. Like at Paddle, we have an operational component that I also handle. That's like 100% typical within an accounting function. Those roles require a certain type of person. Then you have people that are system thinkers that say, how do we optimize using systems? And so, hopefully you've got one or two of those on the team. And if you don't, that's where you kind of supplement with hiring. Okay, how do I take the puzzle of, I need a wide variety of skill sets within the accounting team. And then essentially that dictates who you hire to complement the team.
Amazing. And when you think about that sort of team dynamic, and I want to hone in a little bit more on this notion that what you're really describing is that you have to make sure it's balanced, and that balance is not the same recipe everywhere, because it is entirely dependent on who you have and what their strengths and weaknesses are and what do they enjoy. To that end, how do you think about measuring sort of team burnout, making sure that folks are actually really motivated by what they're doing, really understanding what is it that they enjoy, and making sure that folks are getting more of that and less of what they don't as you grow a team?
Yeah, for me, I think it just comes back to, can you create a culture of vulnerability and openness around, like, hey, there are things in my role I don't like doing, and being comfortable talking about that. I don't need to pretend to be a team leader in which everything's always rosy and I love everything and I'll do anything. It's like, no, we're human beings, and each of us have preferences, natural leanings. And I think it's important to get the team from a culture perspective to be comfortable talking about that. So when I think about my time here at Paddle, for example, we've gone through a couple team restructures. I think the first one was the largest, and then we've tweaked the team since then. And those restructures essentially reallocated within the existing team, who's doing what responsibilities. And sometimes there were reporting line changes. And all of that was done in a lens in which what we wanted to do was say, hey, what does each person want? And then I have to play the juggling act of saying, how do I balance all the requests? And then, present a unified picture of, okay, this is how the team's going to be structured. This is who's responsible for what areas, and making sure that's clearly documented and fully distributed across the team is the way I've managed to navigate that. And oftentimes that org chart diagram with responsibility, summaries underneath each of like, these are the 5 boxes of areas that each person is responsible for, has, to be hired roles where we say, yep, that this is what the future is going to look like. This is what today looks like. This is what the future looks like. And this is where we're going to shift responsibilities to optimize it for what everyone wants.
Got it. And, really, it feels like some of what you're describing there, insofar as just being really thoughtful and reflective on the team, does sound like it starts to dovetail into systems and process. Some of what you're talking through there feels like, even if it's an intrinsic one or one that isn't documented, as most processes are, one that is a process about how you're looking back at the team. Would love to move into systems as your sort of second tier here. You've got great people. You've got a mechanism for making sure that everyone is motivated for the right reasons and balanced as a team, as a unit. How about finding good systems? What's the process there? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah. So just to piggyback off of the segue, right? When I think about people, the people involves the system of managing the people, which we kind of talked about at the end. Now, the second piece of systems, I think of that as these are the platforms, the SaaS applications that you're purchasing that help move all the information to create financial results. So the foundational one is, I would say there's 2 foundational ones. The first one is really, what is your ERP system, which every business has that's tracking anything. And so that system is your hub, right? Then from there's a bunch of systems that will feed into that. And so for me, with that system being the first major one, the second one is actually a close management tool. Now, I think the industry has shifted a bit over the last 10, 15 years to be much more oriented to close management tools as better versions and options have come to the market. But functionally, the purpose of that tool, in my lens, is keeping track or playing like air traffic controller, actually, of like, what are all the things that are happening in a month-end close process, so that we can then measure how we're doing, when are things being done, when things should be done, who's doing it. And that's kind of your foundation of, okay, you layer that on to track that with a close management tool, and then you use that to optimize from there. So those are kind of the 2 main ones. If I were to talk about like all the other adjacent tools, whether it's your AP spend management tools, your HRIS systems, your CRMs, some of those are owned by functions outside of accounting. And at which point they make the system determinations, and you just need to, build collaborative relationships to the extent those systems are not sufficient. But really, it's how do you make sure that those systems can talk to each other in an automated way? Most of those systems can. It just, sometimes there are inherent plugins that system integrations that exist between the both. Sometimes there's not, and you use an iPaaS solution or integration platform as a service. We use Workada here at Paddle, and I've used it in past roles, and that will help connect. But those become much more important as you get closer to later in the stage of close optimization.
Yep. Yeah, I love the analogy as well of the air traffic control. I think it's a timely process with highly dependent variables that no one can go wrong, or else the entire process is jeopardized. I'm curious to that end, where do you feel like some of the biggest challenges are that you faced in reducing close times and getting a team that's running at peak efficiency. Any lessons about how you think about the trade-off of accuracy versus compliance when you're trying to move something quickly, but it is all mission critical?
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges ends up being the cross-functional nature of accounting. Is in we're consuming data and information from across the company. So questions like, hey, is the data in your CRM accurate? Are there sufficient controls to make sure that's accurate from, if you're a SaaS business and or subscription start dates and end dates accurate? So as businesses mature, a startup, sales folks are doing that. Then there's a rev ops or a sales ops team that handles that in terms of having controls in place for that to improve the data accuracy. So as I've joined multiple maturing businesses, sometimes those aren't in place. And you've got to build relationships cross-functionally and help people understand the importance of that in order to drive accurate and timely results. So one of the things about data accuracy is making sure the process ensures that the initial input of the data is accurate. So I was at one of the businesses I was at had a SaaS application in which all of the revenue data for subscription start and end dates was very messy and no one trusted the data. The auditors found issues with it. And what we had to do was we essentially broke the problem into two pieces. We said, hey, we need to fix the process so that going forward, there aren't data issues. And so we prioritized that because essentially we stemmed the bleeding at that point. And then we went through a second exercise to say, okay, let's go back historically and do retroactively the data validation to make sure that all the contract information was accurate. And so that's kind of how we split it to navigate that. And it's a very cross-functional effort because oftentimes folks outside of accounting are helping with that data validation and folks outside of accounting are running those new processes to ensure that accurate data is being captured in our systems.
Where did you feel like the final or ultimate unlock came from shoring this up? What was most challenging about getting a better handle on the revenue data? Is there a specific system in particular that really made a difference here?
We actually deprecated a system in order to achieve the data cleanup. And
Awesome.
Part of that was a QuickBooks to NetSuite transition. So essentially what we had was, and I'll leave this system name anonymous just to be nice, but what we had was we had a CRM system that was feeding into a subscription management tool, which then was feeding into QuickBooks. And really the issue was twofold. People tried to change the data and get it accurate in the subscription management system, but didn't actually go upstream to make sure the CRM system was accurate. So as we transitioned from QuickBooks to NetSuite, we essentially subbed out that middle system, which was functionally middleware, with, hey, let's have our CRM system, Salesforce, talk directly to NetSuite via a Workato iPaaS solution to ensure that, yes, all the data in Salesforce is accurately coming over to NetSuite. And everyone knew, hey, no one would edit NetSuite data to correct anything. Data corrections were only done in one place at source.
Amazing. Always a joy when the answer is actually get rid of something versus tack another thing on. So love that. I want to go back to the people concept and really hone in a little bit more on something that you and I have talked about in the past. Vignettes you have around this sort of SWAT team, as you called it, that you built at ACB Auctions before the IPO. What sort of led to that, and how did that materially change the sort of trajectory of getting towards that proverbial 0-day close of making the operations more efficient for everyone?
Yeah. So the genesis of it was really the initial role as I was talking with my former boss, the controller at ACV. I was looking for a role in which I could have impact. And I spent, about 7 years at PwC, part of it with him as well, essentially taking the opportunity to design and build improved processes in our in our audits. And so I was really excited to join ACV at the time, because essentially what was carved out was a role in which we would, handle technical accounting matters. We would handle process build out. We would handle integration of acquisitions, both the technical accounting matters of it, but also how do we funnel that into our existing business? And so it kind of led me to this framework I like to talk about, which is really, there's three types of work out there: design work, building work, and maintaining work. And everyone's got a different leaning towards each. And I knew at that stage in my career that I really enjoyed the designing and building work, both from a team perspective, from a people perspective, but also from a process systems perspective. And so we slowly built a team that did that at ACV, and there was just new business challenge after new business challenge. We did 7 different acquisitions while I was there, and it was a ton of fun.
Amazing. When you think about the components of that design, build, and maintain framework, where at ACV during that kind of SWAT team assembly and what they were tasked with working on, where were they primarily focused? Would you say across all three? How much maintain really happened? Would love to get a better sense of kind of on the ground what everyone was dealing with.
Yeah, so I think in the early days, the teams were fairly blended, in the sense of we kind of had one accounting team, and there we had someone out on maternity leave, and so what we were working through was just optimizing what existed at the time, and then we knew we needed to add new processes. So at the very beginning, I was actually technically an individual contributor with dotted line into the rest, into a handful of folks that did some of the existing accounting processes. What we did was we slowly built the team over time, such that we built a new process. To the extent it wasn't related to an acquisition, a lot of times we would establish the process. We spent a lot of time in the design and build phase, and then we would either hire within the team for certain processes that ended up being the areas I primarily managed, revenue and acquisition related matters. And that would end up being folks we hired to maintain some of those processes. Others, we would just optimize and then work with our counterparts on the other half of the accounting team to then integrate those acquisitions into their existing team.
So a lot of change management here, a lot of upending what was already existing process, introducing new teams that work slightly differently, but still conceptualizing it, at least in the early stages, as one team. Any resistance that you saw there? How did you kind of gain the conviction that this was the right way to tackle things, especially going through the subsequent acquisitions? How did it all come together?
I think at the end of the day, acquisition, for example, is something that is broad, and it requires like strong cross-functional relationships, both within accounting, but also to other areas of the business, like your people team, your sales teams, etc. And so for me, I think the foundation there of like overcoming resistance is really just, number one, demonstrating that you're keeping an open mind. Like this SWAT team, as I like to call it, that I ran, loved to design and build processes, but it wasn't always that our ideas were the best. So really it's, how can we help facilitate cross-functional discussion to brainstorm on what is the optimal way to integrate this into the business? And sometimes you're doing trade-offs on what is operationally achievable and the time windows that you've got to do it. So once we became a public company, there were fairly strict timelines in which, hey, we had to do this in certain timelines. So you might take shortcuts at the beginning in terms of, hey, this is not like what you would do as you're angling towards a 0-day close, but at least we know, hey, we'll get version 1 in, and then we'll optimize over time as we have capacity.
Makes sense. Where did you see the most tangible impact? How did you measure it? I guess when you think about from a sort of closed timeline as one measure, how did that evolve over the course of the business growing and the sort of integration of this SWAT team and how things evolved over time?
I think that's the toughest question to answer for
Yep.
accounting team. And I think it boils down to the fact that sometimes accounting teams are viewed as a back office function. And I've been fairly fortunate at the companies I've been at for that not to be the case in terms of the importance of what we do is recognized or is recognized. And the collaboration we had with our FP&A counterparts as they worked with their business partners across the business has been great. I think in terms of measuring success, I think it boils down to how often are there surprises? So yes, your speed of your close can be faster, but how often are there I'm going to add a second one. How often are there surprises and how often are there historical mistakes? And so if you get from a 20-day close down to a 3-day close, but the results are never accurate, well, you're losing the confidence of folks across the business to make decisions based on the information you're presenting. So yeah, I think it's really tough to measure, but when you're in the team or as you work with the business leaders and department leaders outside of accounting, outside of finance, the last measurement would be, do they trust you? Do they have confidence that when you say, yep, this is what happened, that it's actually reflective of what really happened in the business, as opposed to 1 month later realizing, oh, just kidding, you were over budget, now you're not.
Certainly. Certainly. I mean, any to that end, any specific soft skills that you think will become increasingly essential, maybe even those that are not obvious in earlier career tracks for those in accounting that you would highlight?
I think it boils down to building cross-functional relationships. It's one thing to say, I have a team and my team will follow the direction that I have. But once you start reaching across functions, how do you influence people to modify their processes? How do you influence people to understand, hey, this is causing friction downstream, and how does that sit within their priority list? And sometimes in those discussions, you acknowledge, hey, yeah, this is causing friction for us, but we're going to deal with it for 6 months, and then we'll revisit it once that other function might have higher priority needs. So I think the ability to build trusting cross-functional relationships to influence your peers in terms of how their processes run, how their departments operate, where they interact with the accounting function is just like super important. So, I hear stories and I've met people who are in controller seats and they really embrace the title of controller. Like they like to control things. And I think having more of an open hand in terms of how are things going to work, being accepting of ideas to change how processes work across functions is important because I think that's what builds trust.
What do you think limits that the most in the way that companies that perhaps are not currently the most forward thinking in how they organize their finance and accounting operations? Where do you think those bottlenecks come from? And how do you think teams can really just start to characterize some of the work differently if necessary to sort of further that?
Yeah, I think the status quo is often an inherent barrier. And so, inertia. So if a company is moving fast and changing, there could be an expectation cross-functionally that things are going to continue to change. And that's part of what I love about working in the venture capital space. And for what I've been told, in the PE-backed space, it exists as well, where there's just an inherent expectation of change. And so in that environment and culture, there's just less friction as you push changes through because people realize, hey, all of our processes are not as mature as we want them to be. because the business is now double what it was last year. I think in businesses that are more steady, there are, processes may not have changed in the last 5 years related to something, and the frequency of process change is inherently lower. So I think there's a lot of, especially as you grow in size of a business, there's just inherent additional red tape and more people that need to be involved in decisions to make sure what you change here doesn't break 10 other things over there. And that kind of slows the pace of change. But even in those environments, I think you can still create a culture of how are we going to brainstorm? How are we going to think about how to make the parts of our job that we don't like to do more efficient? And so that we can spend the time that we want on things that we enjoy doing.
So Nate, you went through an IPO process at ACV, obviously learned a ton through that. Knowing what you know now, thinking about different dynamics about how to best organize teams, how to best structure processes and systems, anything you would approach differently, any really key learnings or heuristics that you think are pretty fundamental?
Yeah. One of the things that I found in that process was realizing you could want the best version of a process, but it would take too long to implement it. So you had to take some kind of shortcut. And shortcut's not like, it wasn't producing inaccurate results. It was just not the most efficient process. So maybe we had people downloading information from a system, manipulating it in Excel, and then loading it into our ERP system. But what I think motivated me the most as I was leaving ACV and looking for my next role was actually this concept of how can I get into a business earlier, not within 1 year of a target IPO or 2 years of actually completing the IPO, but can I get in 2 or 3 years earlier in a role in which we could start laying the foundation from a people, systems, process perspective, so that by the time we got to an IPO, we have best-in-class processes in place, at which point, a 5-7 day close at a even relatively complex business is achievable.
Excellent. So reflecting on everything we've talked about today, if you were to give yourself feedback, a piece of advice, something in the vein of aspiring to more efficient process, the 0-day close, 10 years ago, this is former Nate you're speaking to, what would you say? What would that be? What would that feedback be to yourself?
I think there's 2 things. Number 1 is, how do you influence people? Think about that more. Spend more time understanding the psychology of humans. We all are motivated by different things. We all have different incentive structures. And how do you spend more time learning about how that works? For me, this kind of hit me when I first left public accounting, because I realized there weren't just 2 groups of people, the auditors and the client. There were 10. There was accounting, FP&A, HR, legal, sales, marketing, account managers, other folks in the business, depending on the type. There were so many competing priorities and incentive structures that each of those departments were operating under. And so learning about that was really important and something I was surprised, and it broadened my mindset. I think the second piece is technology. I think I found it interesting that, fortunately for me, I've had a lot of good peers at the companies I've worked with that know so much more about data warehouses and APIs and SFTPs and webhooks. And I've found myself just having a leaning towards curiosity and learning, asking questions about how do those things work? What's best practice around data table structures? And what is an API? A lot of accountants might not know that. I didn't when I first got into private accounting and left public. And I think learning and embracing that technological world and trying to get technical with folks enables you to think about how do you structure accounting processes to make them better? And so I think I stumbled into that, but I would have loved for someone 10 years ago to have said, Nate, think about people, dynamics, incentive structures of all the different departments in a business, and like focus on understanding technology and all of systems and data interfaces, because it's complicated, but it's important to learn and at least conceptually understand, especially in the role of a controller.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, Nate, we're unfortunately coming up on our time here. So where can folks go to learn more about you, about Paddle?
Yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you want to chat about any of these topics. Very passionate. I love this space that we all operate in. For Paddle, go to paddle.com. We serve businesses globally around the world, solving payment optimization, sales tax, compliance for a ton of businesses around the world. So
Great.
check us out.
Great. Well, Nate, thanks again. Really appreciate you spending time with us today. It was fantastic having you on our inaugural incoming statements, getting your take on all things zero-day close, building teams that are motivated and excited to do the work, and thinking a little bit about how some of that might change and how folks might set themselves up for the next generation of accountants. Appreciate the time.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Take care.
You've been listening to Incoming Statements, a production of Numeric. To learn how AI and automation are eliminating the manual burdens holding your accounting team back, visit numeric.io. Join us next time to hear from more top accounting voices on the challenges they're facing and where they see the industry heading.